We're delighted. I'm Shannon Rudisol, for those of you who don't know me, the Executive Director of Early Childhood Funders Collaborative. We're hosting this session today because facilities has been an area that we have a lot of interest in among our members. And I think that is in general an area that in the 20 some years I've been in early childhood is sort of a constant. That has come up, but our ability to work on it, I would say, as a field has waxed and waned at various points in time. And I feel like we are in a waxing phase right now. There's been a lot of, not only is there more work going on, there's more interest and there's more CDFIs getting involved and there's more funders interested. So we are in, I would say, a waxing period. With the National Children's Facilities Network kind of revitalized and some other key things that are in place. And we know that more and more funders have been interested in it too. So for ECFC members or prospective members that are coming to our meeting, our membership meeting in May, you will be able to see the project that we're going to talk about today in real life, in person. It is one of the site visits. But on a site visit like that, with a lot of things to cover, you will not hear all of the details of how it came together, I'm going to use this term, I don't know what it means, but I hear Kirby talking about it all the time. You won't hear all about the financing stack. We won't go all in detail like that at the site visit because we won't have time. So for those of you who want to go on that site visit, you will hear this here, or because we have other fabulous site visits, you're going to go on a different one. You're going to get the opportunity to get a little bit of what you would learn there on this one, on this call. And also, even if you're not joining us, I think this will be a great example for you of the way that foundations can work on facilities and places. Okay. With that, I am going to suggest that we do a super quick round of introductions, and let's keep it quick. I won't do like name, foundation, and the place that you work in, whether that's national or the place that you are currently sitting in. And I will kick it over to Shannon.
And I am Shannon Katsaratis. I am with the Buffett Early Childhood Fund, and we are located in Omaha, Nebraska, engaged both in a place-based work as well as national work. And I will kick it over to Eric.
Hi, everybody. Eric Buchanan with the Buffett Early Childhood Fund. As Shannon said, we fund largely in Nebraska, but also nationally in certain areas. I will say that the waxing and the waning on the facilities is we're waxing too. But I think we've always kind of been on the wax side. It just seems like it's hard to find the right coalitions and approaches to really kind of push this a little farther. So I'm also going to take this opportunity to do a little bit of plug for some work that we co-funded with the Heising Science Foundation through LISC to do a toolkit and also some other work. So I'm going to pop that in the chat. Good to see everybody.
Okay, Eric.
Whitney.
Okay, is Whitney still here or did she drop off? All right.
She must have popped out.
Oh,
how about Robin?
Yeah, sounds great, Robin.
Hi, everyone. I am in a public space today, so it might be a little noisy, but I am the project director for the Early Childhood Funders Alliance of Southwestern Pennsylvania. It's great to be here. I am very curious about the facilities conversation because it's something that keeps coming up here in PA as well as Georgia. That's where I am based in Atlanta. So it will be great to learn. And I'll pass it to Kelly.
This isn't working so great. All right. Kelly, are you there? Maybe she can't come off mute. All right, Nancy.
Good afternoon. I am Nancy Jost. I work for West Central Initiative, which is a small rural community foundation in West Central Minnesota. And we do our granting in the area of West Central Minnesota. And we've done facilities for a long time, but we never have enough to do pay for a whole facility. So we partner with many others.
Jose.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Jose Rodriguez, Director of the Community Capital Portfolio at the Robert R. McCormick Foundation in Chicago. We're place-based in two communities, Inglewood and Little Village. Work very closely with my colleague, Brian Stokes, who's joined the call. And I spend most of my time looking at opportunities to partner with communities to deploy capital for facilities. We've invested about $14 million over the last year doing so. It's been a learning journey. But also just a pure delight to be able to see progress on facility development in Chicago. Great to be with everyone. And I'll turn it over to my colleague, Brian.
Thanks, Jose. Hi, everybody. Brian Stokes, Director of the Education Portfolio at McCormick Foundation in Chicago, which is, our education work is mostly focused on birth through kindergarten, some statewide policy, but increasingly focused on Chicago itself. And I'll hand it to Kirby.
Kirby Burkholder from IFF. It's nice to see a lot of familiar faces, and many of you could make this presentation probably as well. I'm in our Chicago office today, but I'll be talking about our work in Detroit. I live in Metro Detroit, so I'll be co-presenting with Jonathan. I'm at IFF, which is a regional CDFI that does robust place-based efforts on a number of different things, including really robust work in early childhood education, and great to connect with folks. I'll pass it to Eddie.
Hi, Eddie Gale. I work with the A.D. Henderson Foundation in the state of Vermont, and I look forward to seeing what you're doing in Detroit. Rachel, have you called?
I haven't. Nice to be with you all. I'm Rachel Bonson. I'm the director of Liftoff of Western New York. We're an aligned action network of about 30 funders within the 8 counties of Western New York, which is roughly the size of Connecticut, that are focused on a set of early childhood priorities, including addressing our childcare crisis in Western New York and the state. So great to be with you and looking forward to learning more today. And I will go to the other Rachel.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Rachel Langford. I was masquerading as Mark Holloway a moment ago. I'm standing in like, who is this person? I'm representing Social Venture Partners in Portland, Oregon, and we're a philanthropy that has been largely focused on early childhood for the last 15 years. And we have an initiative focused on childcare facilities currently that I'm leading with my colleague, Mark. Really looking forward to being here. Thank you. And I'll call on Kelly. Did Kelly go?
Let's see if Kelly can unmute. We know Whitney cannot. There's something going on in Kansas. Kelly.
Hi, everyone. This is Kelly Doyle with the Greater Kansas City Community Foundation and the Stanley H. Strode Foundation. I do work closely with Whitney Hosty, so I'll let everyone know she's here too. We are working with the Stanley H. Strode Foundation out of Kansas City, Missouri. Oh, and I need to popcorn it to someone else.
Well, the only person left, I think, is Rena. So let's let Rena do it, and then we will talk. We will introduce Jonathan and let him go.
Great, thank
Hi,
you.
I'm Rena Large. I'm the program manager for Early Childhood Funders Collaborative, and I get to do cool things like this that connect people around topics of shared interest. And I think that did Renee introduce herself? She's not.
Oh no, I was worried about her not feeling well. Go ahead, Renee, if you feel like you can come off mute.
Thank you. Yeah. Hi, everyone. Apologies for being off video. I'm Renee Nogales from the Burke Foundation. We focus on the first 1,000 days, and I'm calling in from Philadelphia, but we invest in the state of New Jersey. Happy to be here.
All right, I appreciate everybody taking the time to do that. First of all, I'll say this topic is interesting because we have the highest yield of registrants to attendees than I can recall in a long time. So I think we have a super interested group. And I appreciate folks taking the time to do that introduction, because I think one thing that we learned through COVID is, although it can seem long and you're looking at people on boxes and you're listening to names, if we all show up frequently enough to these, we start to actually feel like we know each other, because now we're going through our registration list for our meeting and I'm like, wait, have I really never met that person in person? I feel like we're friends. I mean, we've been emailing. So I think that that is the result of the patience and tolerance that we have for doing these when we have a small enough group to do them. So I appreciate you being willing to do that. And I see Kiami Harris, our Chief Equity and Strategy Officer, joined us. Just wave, Kiami. We just did. Okay. And so I will introduce or kick it to Jonathan, but introduce him. I want to first say, as we kick it to Jonathan from Jonathan Way from Kresge Foundation, Senior Program Officer with Kresge Foundation, that not only is he going to talk about this very exciting work, Jonathan has been a fabulous partner to ECFC as we plan for our trip to Detroit. And it's been wonderful to work with, and is one of our fabulous hosts in that city. So we're grateful that you're here and we appreciate your work, and I'm happy to turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much. And it's really great to see everyone. Thanks for this opportunity. Yeah, we're Kirby and I are really excited to just share a little bit of framing with you all for those that are coming to Detroit, and we'll see the work happening on the Marygrove campus. But also for those that might not make it, I'm excited to share this work with you. Again, I'm Jonathan Hoy. I lead our work in Detroit, supporting what we're calling child and family centered neighborhoods, which is an intersection of our early childhood and education work and our community development work. And one of those intersections is early childhood facilities. I'm going to just very quickly share some framing around, just to situate you in the project and some of the context there, situate you in Detroit, situate you in the neighborhood, and can go from there. Do you all see a full screen? Okay, so kind of just to show where this this project is in, it's on the campus of a former Catholic liberal arts college called Marygrove College. It experienced declining enrollment over time and ultimately closed in 2019. We, alongside many partners, worked with the college to re-envision that campus as a cradle-to-career campus with early childhood as its anchor. But what I wanted to kind of first show is the historical context here. You'll see the colors represent median income, that within this 2 square mile radius, you have incomes ranging from like $20,000 to over $100,000. So this is a really economically diverse area, but also you can see it has some really significant issues of poverty and vacancy. And at the same time, a really deep history, a deep cultural history that we want to make sure this work elevates. And so kind of the strategy in re-envisioning this entire neighborhood as a child and family centered neighborhood, you can see there all these things, right, that like all together come to contribute to how this neighborhood is a neighborhood where families want to raise their children. And that is the North Star is, you know, for families that are in the neighborhood, do you have the amenities, the opportunities, the quality of life, the kind of opportunities for socioeconomic mobility where you want to stay and raise your children? Or if you don't live in Detroit, for you to believe that a Detroit neighborhood can be a place where you can raise your kids. And that's really the North Star in thinking about how all of these investments together contribute to a child and family centered neighborhood. So whether it's like the physical infrastructure, whether it's public spaces, whether it's retail, whether it's programming, all of these things, how they support a neighborhood that centers kids and families. At the center of that is a cradle to career campus. And this is the Marygrove College. It's 53 acres. This campus was going to go dark before these partners stepped in. And with these partners, you now have an early childhood center that serves kids from prenatal to 5, operated by a nonprofit early childhood operator. You have a K-12 school that is a partnership between the Detroit School District. It is a traditional public school with a neighborhood catchment. They partner with the University of Michigan to bring the resources of the University of Michigan, led by its School of Education, onto this campus. and then also partners with them on post-secondary programming. The landlord, the Marygrove Conservancy, now owns the land and provides wraparound services, arts and culture programming, child and family kind of economic mobility programming. So really envisioning this as a campus that's aligned vertically, right, from cradle to career, but also horizontally, right? At any given point in a kid's life, how can this campus serve all of the wide range of their needs? And so where we have gone to date is there is now a full high school operated. The Early Childhood Center opened in 2021, and last year kind of graduated its first class into kindergarten. Those students automatically are enrolled into the on-campus kindergarten, so there's that transition there. You'll see here some of the other things that have opened on campus, really kind of focusing on kids and families on this campus. And so kind of why I wanted to situate that context is so you can see how this new build early education center is not just a standalone center, but really is part of kind of this broader model. And really the hope for this early education center is it's a $22 million new build. And Kirby can talk about all the financing and all of the details there. But really the hope is for this center to demonstrate the national best practices of, you know, what does it look like to build a facility, to program the facility, to finance the facility using these best practices, really focus on like nature-based, play-based outdoor learning. And you'll see some pictures here, and you'll see more in person of kind of how the center incorporates a lot of these practices. And so, you know, as I transition to Kirby, something that we wanted to both highlight to you all is, you know, how this center really brings a lot of these practices that you see in bullet points here to life. And you know, what are some opportunities we're hoping to be able to learn from other places that you all work in, but also how some of this work can be a catalyst for work that's happening around the country. And really kind of these practices as a combination of both a systems play. So Hope Starts Here, and you'll hear more about that in Detroit, is Detroit's first early childhood framework and partnership that built through a community engagement process. So this is the early childhood systems play. When you combine that with a place-based cradle to career proof point, that is the kind of deep in place strategy. Combine that with the broad systems play with Hope Starts Here. I think the hope is that's how you get kind of this model for an exemplary facility that takes both a systems approach in thinking about scaling, but also how this is really deeply rooted in its neighborhood. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kirby to kind of talk a little bit more about the project and really the amazing leadership of IFF as a CDFI to really shepherd this project forward.
Thanks, Jonathan. I have some slides too I'll share in a second, but we're really comfortable too if folks want to just pop questions in the chat as we go. One of the angles I was going to take was to take just a little bit of a step back and really answer 4 key questions. As I said earlier, I recognize a lot of faces from our work in the Bipartisan Policy Center. I'm an executive committee member of the National Children's Facilities Network. Lots of familiar people on this call, and folks obviously probably could each add a dimension to this. But I wanted to bring this from the perspective of what we'd like funders to know about facilities from where we sit. So this is just sort of our point of view. Then what funders typically ask us. Then what are the unique challenges in Detroit? So if you're going to come to Detroit, we want to talk about sort of what we think is different or special about what's going on in Detroit. And then finally, what's applicable everywhere. So I'm going to kind of do a little bit of a pivot and then come back to some of the pieces. But I'll take us a little bit back to, I'm just going to share my screen. Take 1 second here. Just confirming folks can see it. Oh, great. Okay. So one of the things that we think is important is to take us back at least to our journey into Detroit. I moved to Detroit in December of 2013. And at that time, Jonathan and his foundation, along with the largest foundations in Michigan, have been part of something called the Southeast Michigan Early Childhood Funders Collaborative, which still exists. And there was a number of different investments that were going on, partly to respond to some pretty material events around the Head Start rebid in Detroit, but also generally to respond to the early childhood ecosystem. But what was going on in Detroit was a lot of anecdotes, like you hear in a lot of communities. So it's all family friend and neighbor care, it's all home-based care, it's all center care, it's Head Start, it's this, it's that. And so back in 2015, we worked with Kresge to get some funding for us to do a landscape assessment, a needs assessment. I know a number of organizations here are involved in those. Some of our peer groups across the country, LISC does these, Reinvestment Fund has done them, LIF is getting involved in those. But we did a landscape scan that really tried to look at some tools to get beyond those anecdotes to focus on the areas of highest needs. So stakeholders, including philanthropy, can make informed decisions about how to make investments to support the overall ecosystem. One of our findings was we had a gap of about 27,000 slots, quality seats in Detroit. And 2013, this is pre-bankruptcy, right? So this is around Detroit Future City, kind of the reworking framework of the city. And there was just a lot of uncertainty. The point of this slide is to really demonstrate that some folks sort of think about CDFIs only as lenders. And one of the things we all know is that debt is not always right for early childhood. In fact, many early childhood centers and homes struggle either accessing SBA financing and or financing in general because the margin is so small. And so there's capital absorption issues, there's all kinds of other issues. So this is not to say that debt's the only tool, but it is to say that we have to come at this, at least from where we sit, in multiple ways, right? So this highlights some of the ways we as an organization are trying to show up to tackle these gaps. So the top left-hand corner, development. So the project that Jonathan's talking about. When we did this initial study, we came up with 5 recommendations. There were 3 policy recommendations. One is we've got to increase participation in the quality rating system. 2 was we have to move to a full day, full year model that better responds to the needs of families. 3 was in order to do those first 2 things, we have to invest in providers. We've got to support provider capacity on those dimensions. And then we had 2 facilities recommendations. We have to invest in high quality programs in spite of their space, because there were some significant challenges around facilities issues. And we have to change the conversation in Detroit around facilities. I certainly know for the Chicago folks, we've been involved in early childhood facilities development in Chicago for decades. In Detroit, that just hadn't happened. There were no kind of stellar facilities. And so even this idea of what does it look like to have high quality facilities by Detroit for Detroit was, we had a completely different conversation. So if you make your way around, one of the things we started to do to align programmatic and facilities quality is with support from the Kresge Foundation, the Kellogg Foundation, the Skillman Foundation, Max and Marjorie Fisher Foundation, PNC. We designed a program called Learning Spaces, which is where we align our real estate experts with the early childhood providers, home and center-based. We go through and assess their facilities needs. We help them develop a facilities plan. And then we provide grants to those providers, home and center-based, for-profit and nonprofit, to begin to implement facilities improvements and help them become facilities champions. And subsequently with NCFN, we produced a piece under the Making Spaces part where some of those folks are lifting up their voice around that story. So the idea is we start to move the needle kind of site by site around aligning real estate expertise and quality. You can see we've served over 3,200 children there. And our moonshot, our exemplar, has been this Marygrove Center. So now we have a place in Detroit, built in Detroit within the context of neighborhoods that really then does show what's possible in a place where there have been some significant investment. Just wanted to highlight some of the other ways we're working, innovation and policy. We're working on, we have a development company we've stood up. We're working on some of the concepts that mission-driven finance has been leading on the concept of the C-REIT and ways in which we can attract impact investment at scale to support the development of early childhood facilities, homes, and centers. Our lending program, we have done some direct lending when that works. It doesn't always work, as we said. We have a real estate consulting practice. And as Jonathan mentioned, we've got Hope Starts Here. IFF was the liaising organization to hire the consultant to develop it and has been leading the facilities dimensions of the overall framework. So I'm just getting to my next slide here. I'm sorry. So one of the things we'd like funders to know about facilities, and you all know a lot about facilities, so I say this with humility, but it's just a little bit from where we said, based on some of our experiences. So facilities matter, right? I mean, you've talked about waxing and waning, and you're all joined this call. So I believe that you believe that. I think that's important, right? We've been spending a lot of time in the context of nonprofit facilities where folks have said, you know, this is emerging science, right? We really think it's important to have the research-based components of facilities as third teacher. And so we're doing our best as we go, as research comes out, to document the research grounded aspects of facilities that actually are aligned, proven to be aligned with educational outcomes. Those are things like ceiling height, those are things like color, those are things like access to natural light. There's multiple dimensions of emerging research that really are thinking about that. And then the idea that there is alignment between programmatic and facilities quality. And if we're together in person, you know, I usually ask people to raise their hands, but if anyone's ever been to a conference or a session and they've been freezing cold the whole time and they get asked to fill out the survey and they're like, this was terrible, I was freezing. And then, because first I ask people if they think facilities matter, as most people say no. And then I tell that story and they're like, right, I get it. It can completely impact my ability to learn and engage, depending how comfortable I feel, how safe I feel, how healthy I feel, and how healthy the space feels. But you're believers in that. The second thing is bifurcating homes and centers limits progress on all facilities. We've had lots of conversations with national funders that will say, I only focus on homes, I only focus on centers. I'm not here to judge that. I'm here to say that when we bifurcate that, we lose the ability to support the entire ecosystem by thinking about what's in common. Ongoing maintenance, capital improvements, building envelope, those are all common to all settings. And so rather than saying we're only going to serve this part of the sector, how can we have baseline information related to the context of facilities and then think about what's specific to the work of homes, specific to the work of centers? Bifurcating funding sources can limit progress on facilities. This has a lot to do with the older models we saw in Detroit, where Head Start as an identity was really negatively impacting the ability of us to make progress on facilities overall. So how do we center children and families and think of Head Start as a funding source versus thinking of Head Start as that primary identity? We can talk a lot about that. And finally, facilities and finance are inextricably linked. I always tell the story, but we work in Louisville, and we went to Louisville to visit an early childhood center that was in a building that was owned by the housing authority, that was staffed by a lot of AARP volunteers and had a no-cost, low-cost lease. And everyone's like, isn't this amazing? And we'd say it is amazing, except for we have a structural deficit built into this model. And if we lose our low-cost, no-cost lease, the concessionary arrangement with the landlord, or we have to hire staff, the whole place closes. So how do we think about the relationship between operating models and facilities, particularly for people that aren't bricks and mortar? How do we think about the way that those pieces come together? Next item is what funders typically ask. Why facilities? I won't spend time on that, you haven't asked. Are seats or facilities a lagging indicator? So in Detroit, we have really robust conversations around a Hope Starts Here framework, which has 6 priorities, everything from the first 1,000 days to workforce to programmatic quality to facilities. And folks sometimes want to argue about which is leading and lagging. And we're really of the opinion that they are inextricably linked together. And so rather than making it a binary where we start to say, well, which is more important, they're all important. So how can we understand the extent to which they relate to each other? Doesn't licensing address facilities issues? I think a lot of you know that. No, these 2 pictures, which might be a little bit difficult to tell with the size of the slide, are from licensed facilities in Detroit. When we first got to Detroit, we were walking through facilities, it just would take your breath away, the conditions. Mold, water damage, really terrible air quality, really serious issues around overcrowding and egress and access, all in licensed facilities, many of whom had received ratings in the quality rating improvement system that were not being measured or caught, essentially, or tracked by the licensing framework. Same thing with our quality rating improvement systems methodologies. Across the Midwest, we have a number of robust. The only state that does not participate is Missouri. And so I know that in our work in Kansas City in particular, we just released a study in Kansas City looking at Missouri and Kansas. It's even more complicated in places that don't have a quality rating system, but Michigan is a place where we do. but our quality rating improvement system does not speak to facilities quality. So you could be a 5-star center and have some significant facilities challenges that aren't addressed. So it's something to be mindful of. And then I also just alluded to quickly, we don't fund bricks and mortar, so what's our role? Lots of opportunities, capacity building, awareness around facilities, thinking about how to inform strategy and strategic questions, and how to think about this longer term operating and financial sustainability components. Sorry, and if there's questions that come up, I'm having trouble just with my screen to see it. It looks like there's some stuff in the chat, but so I can pause. So what are the unique challenges in Detroit? So as I should have mentioned, in addition to my roles there, I've been at IFF for 22 years. I started in our Chicago office. I opened our work in St. Louis. I lived there, opened our work in Kansas City, and then moved to Detroit, opened our work in Michigan and Ohio. So we've kind of got a broad view. And then I want to speak specifically to what is different in Detroit. So I already talked about the anecdotes issue. The second issue was Detroit at the time, 2013-14, was the land of the sideload programs. It was half-day Head Start, half-day early Head Start, half-day after school. And in addition to, and Jonathan can talk more about this, the enormous challenges we have in Detroit around mobility and a very ill-equipped public transportation infrastructure that was exacerbated by the fact that programs weren't designed to respond to families' needs. So many parents just opted out because it would mean 3 bus rides to try and get kids to a half-day program, and at a certain point, it's not meeting families' needs. Very small programs. It was not uncommon for us to see 2 and 3 classroom centers. With that, we can't be at scale at 2 and 3 classrooms. So even if folks could work on a braided blending funding model, they were constrained by the size of the program, which made it very difficult to be able to scale and address issues. Bad commercial leases, in fact, terrible commercial leases, which had they created enormous risk. And so that was a big challenge. Churches as landlords, this was a double whammy. So I don't know if you were paying attention to the national media in 2013 to 2015, but Detroit was going through some challenges. And if there are churches that might have had 500 parishioners that went down to 15 parishioners, even if you had a good lease, if a repair was needed at that church, there were no resources to pay for it. So we had bad leases, but that was even worse with the fact that like a lot of the landlords had really atrophying financial capacity to be able to live up to their obligations under the lease structures. So that was something that was really challenging. And then finally, the robust funding ecosystem that did not include a facilities focus were invested in leased spaces. And so when I would go in the early days, I would think I was working the philanthropy's nerves. Jonathan can tell me if it's true or not, but I would come with my drum in 2014 and say, facilities, 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 facilities. People were like, why facilities? Like, what are you talking about? That was a waning, I think, part of the curve. But fortunately, in philanthropy in Detroit has really stepped up in a big way to think comprehensively and thoughtfully about facilities issues. Just a couple stats from that time. In 2016, we looked at 40 of our providers in 88 locations. 47% of them were in church basements. 26% of them were in active or former schools. And so you add those two together, 87% of them were leasing. And those lease rates range from $3.37 a square foot to $37 a square foot. So we also were exacerbated by, because of the way folks were reeling from Head Start rebids, people were entering into 1-year lease renewals with really bad leases, with really vulnerable landlords, and philanthropy was pumping lots and lots of money through the Early Childhood Funders Collaborative into the ecosystem. And some of it just blew away because there wasn't the stickiness, there wasn't the staying power of facility stability that was a complement to those incredible dollars that were going and resources going into programmatic investments. So what's applicable everywhere? I won't read the slide to you. You can get a sense there. But generally what we're thinking about is this idea of the relationship between stability of program and facilities and how those two things relate to each other. So even for folks that aren't bricks and mortar, what are the dimensions we can think about that relate to that in terms of the overall framework? And this idea of aligning programmatic and facilities quality. It's difficult in some of our communities, and we talk to our colleagues at LIFT and Reinvestment Fund, capital impact and LISC all the time about this. If you're in a state where you've already received the highest rating on the quality rating improvement system and the facilities are challenged, that's really difficult for a CDFI to show up and say, hey, I think you've got some facilities issues, because where's the standing? And so I think this idea of alignment across credentialing systems and alignment across the ways in which philanthropy can be kind of a support is incredibly important. And this idea of, as Jonathan mentioned, I'll come back now to Marygrove, about how early childhood really can be a stabilizing community anchor, and the richness and possibility of data-informed and data-led strategies that matriculate ready learners from early childhood programs into the K-12 system. So some of you are from some Rust Belt cities and places where there's some challenges around the K-12, the stability of the K-12 system. And so even within the context of the work that Jonathan highlighted, because we kept going back to a data-informed strategy, we could then sit with Detroit Public Schools Community District, we could sit with the local early childhood providers, home and center base, when this new state-of-the-art center comes in. And we could sit with those systems as they matriculate and help people have a more holistic view of how all these pieces and parts fit together. Our concern was, by bringing a brand new center in, that nothing happens in a vacuum. One of the maps we can show you is all the other little dots of supply around this center. So Kresge was incredibly thoughtful and said, we're going to do a hyper-local learning spaces program in and around the Marygrove Center, so that as we're making this investment in this center itself, we are also making investment in folks that have been in the neighborhood, run small businesses, home-based providers, and centers for generations. And we're thinking about a cohesive approach to the early child ecosystem that is agnostic around setting, can be home or center based. It's not agnostic around quality, because we're all pushing toward quality in the quality rating improvement system. And then is really thinking thoughtfully about, in every setting, we're working toward aligning the facilities and programs in a way that is really supporting all dimensions of the experience of folks in that space. The last thing I want to add here, just because workforce is on here too, we also think of facilities as a workforce strategy. I know that sometimes people are like, what are we saying exactly? One of the issues we saw in Detroit frequently, stop sharing for a second, is that children and providers were sick a lot. And providers, teachers, assistants didn't want to come to work every day in facilities that made them sick, or places that they didn't feel valued or safe. And so the idea of, within the competition and all the constraints we have about the hourly wages, I mean, Five Guys Burgers and Fries pays more than certified teachers in Michigan. These have to be places people want to be, right? Not only do we want them to be healthy and flourish, and we want the kids to be healthy and flourish, but it also has to be an investment in the people that are there every day. So that was a lot, and it was a lot of talking. I want to pause for a second, Jonathan, see if you want to put a finer point on anything I added. We can kind of go back to your slides if you want, and I also want to just open the chat for a second and see if I missed something.
No, nothing to add. Thanks, Kirby.
So see, one of the questions, oh, go ahead, sorry, Shannon.
Oh, I was going to read questions from
sure.
the chat. So
Yeah.
It sounds like you were right on it. I thought you the first one, though, I guess, and I'll say, Jonathan, my screen might have frozen, so I didn't get to see your pretty pictures. I only saw the map. Other people might have been able to see all your slides, but if we need to see pictures, you might have to show.
Oh, did my slides not progress?
No, I was going to ask Jonathan, yeah, we saw your first one, and then we saw a wheel, and I thought the wheel was on my end. But yeah, so maybe while we're talking, we should throw that.
I will, yeah, there were like 7 slides that I moved through. Sorry about that. I'll send them out so that we don't spend any more time. We can spend time in discussion.
But I think the first question actually from Nancy, how does philanthropy work with government so that government doesn't shirk its responsibility? That's one thing I'm not sure y'all covered. Like, how much government money went in here? Like, how does that all work? So let's just throw that one out first.
Sure. So I think it's an excellent question. It's something we think about all the time too, and we talk to Jonathan and his team about all the time too, because ultimately this is a scaling issue, right? Even if everybody wrote checks, we never get there. So we're working on this on multiple dimensions. So I know, I think there's someone here, someone was from Minnesota, right? Nancy, maybe that was you, right? So First Children's Finance is administering the $30 million program in Minnesota. We're doing the $50 million program in Michigan. I know our colleagues at LIF are doing 150 million in California. Our colleagues at LISC are doing the Arizona program. Our colleagues at Mission Driven Finance are doing the Nevada program, and we're kind of expanding. So one of the things we're trying to do with that, and so just what I mean by that is, I think folks know from ARPA funds flowed through 2 states, and then states could decide how they wanted to deploy resources. The state of Michigan took $100 million, and thanks to the fabulous partnership from Kresge and the work that they've done with Kellogg at the state level, the state took the $100 million pie, half of it went to facilities improvement, so 50 million, and that's what we're administering. 25 million is going to kind of workforce and programmatic quality, and 25 is kind of a reserve to support other parts of the ecosystem. So that's also not enough. However, what we're trying to do is collect as much data as we can, and then use that to continue those conversations with the state about public investment in this work. One of the challenges we've experienced, and we've been talking through NCFN and Bipartisan Policy Center, our colleagues, is that the parameters by which that first pot of money is flowed to the states is incredibly constrained because we have to follow the Child Care Development Block Grant guidelines. So we're not really going to move the needle that much. But demonstrating the ability to actually tackle this in a thoughtful way and having resources to document and evaluate what's happened, I think is critical to make the case to those public funding entities about what's possible. So round 2, round 3, or programmatic design, I think necessarily have to be informed by that. Another thing we've been working at, and I know Shannon is at this table as well, through Bipartisan Policy Centers, we've worked pretty heavily over the course of the past, actually since before COVID, advocating for a national facilities assessment, so that any legislation that comes forward, this was originally contemplated in Build Back Better, and then there were some challenges. But as these bills come for consideration in Washington, is to ensure that they have a point of view about a thoughtful exploration of facilities issues, so that when folks are making public resourcing decisions, those decisions are informed by the conditions on the ground. So I think that's not going to be all the answers, right? But certainly from a facilities perspective, those are a couple of the ways we're doing that. So I'd encourage you, if you're with, and I know obviously FCF and lots of other folks, anyone that in your geography, we'd love to just continue to compare notes on that, because I think we have to work collectively to make the case. And part of making the case is like, we all have to show up at some part of the table, but none of us can do it by ourselves, right? So I think it's a really great question. Thanks. Jonathan, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I may add a couple of quick things. I think one is whether philanthropy can support and elevate the role of CDFIs in doing this work. Because I think one thing we've learned in Michigan is, I imagine it's probably similar in many states, is like the government might issue grants, but it's really hard for smaller providers to access public funding directly. And also to know what to do with the money. Like, you get a $15,000 check to renovate, but like, how do you find a contractor? How do you negotiate scope? Like, and I think like through the Learning Spaces program with IFF, like the providers are wrapped around, right? They get TA, they get support building a budget, they get support identifying contractors, they get support applying for the money, so that smaller providers are not disproportionately kind of disadvantaged from the application process. And I think like if philanthropy can seed and build the infrastructure, like a learning space, right, at a CDFI, government can just say, well, there's an infrastructure already built. Like, we don't have to pay for the infrastructure. We can just give them the money and they can run with it. And I think, that I think we're hoping is one opportunity in other places too. And I know many of our colleagues are doing that work in many other cities. I think the other is like whether philanthropy can fund a proof point, and always welcome pushback on that, and whether the wisdom of spending $22 million in grant money and building a proof point. But I do think like what we've been able to do is like walk state legislators through a place where they can, I think, Nancy, to your point about considering the outside and building facilities, is walking them through some of these pictures that I couldn't share, but like walking them through the outdoor playground, right? Like, and having them see, like, be able to touch and feel what like high quality outdoor spaces can look like what connection to nature can look like. And so I think, I think that in itself, it's an expensive proof point, but also we're hoping that like that can generate a lot of public funding for state legislators to see like this is what facilities can look like. Even if it doesn't look like this, it can take elements from this and they can include this in legislation in some ways. So that's our hope.
Hey, Brian, do you want to ask your question out loud? Because I think if I read it, it won't do it justice.
Yeah, I think it was, Kirby, as you were sort of talking about the role of the environment as the third teacher, you sort of said you see that as being an emerging, or there are emerging practices there. And I guess I was wondering, what is it you're seeing as still emerging or not quite yet solid? I think of us as having a pretty, like of all of the kind of elements of early childhood, a pretty strong thinking, thought process around the role of the environment. So I was just curious, kind of what are you seeing as still emerging?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that this is one of the things that we've discovered as we've expanded across the Midwest. I mean, without a doubt, Illinois is the Midwest leader in early childhood kind of across the board. So both within the context of advocacy and being data informed, and even from facilities, right? Like, the work we've done with Centers for New Horizons or Carol Robertson Center, or even the work we did with Leslie Bates in East St. Louis. So I think it kind of varies by state. The part that's been more emergent is the actual research. So we would go to a number of the Association for Learning Environments conferences, or we would go to a number of national convenings where there's not a robust body of research that actually documents, like in a statistically significant way, or like real credentialed research that starts to show the connection. And so the part that's emergent, we've been collecting it. So we have a whole presentation we do that literally runs through the concept and then documents where that research work comes from. And so in some states, it feels like there's consensus. But if someone comes to me and says, why should I spend X on this facility? And how do I know for sure it's going to have a difference on academic outcomes? That is, right now, that file is a short list of papers. It's not as robust as it could be.
Yeah, I would just add, that's interesting, Brian, you thought we were more well developed. I'll be honest, if somebody came to me and said, I've got X amount of dollars, what do I spend them on? I'd be like, improve interactions however you can. Like, it doesn't have to be a BA, it doesn't have to be this, it doesn't have to be that, like improve interactions, right? And so I think that might be part of what's driving that too, is like, we think there's only so much money. We're always trying to figure out like, what is the main thing? Because we can't afford all the things, and so that might be, I'm just thinking about conversations I've been in over 20 years, like that might be driving part of that, right? Is like, so yeah, we know, I mean, we study Reggio Emilia, we look at all these things, right? But we have such a sense of scarcity, right? That like, I only have this much, where do I put it?
Yeah, kind of along those lines, one of the best we've gone all around the country. We've looked at a number of different locations. One of the really interesting projects is in Miami, and they have a center there that really looks at it's a functioning center, but it's also intended to be a little bit of a teaching center. So I'll just take shading, like outdoor shading in a playground. They have high, medium, and low. In other words, like, low cost entry, medium cost entry, state of the art. And the installations are throughout the facility. So part of what we're trying to do, even with Marygrove, is how do we take these concepts and help folks understand that every provider's journey is not going to be to a multi-site, group of centers, that in each place a provider sits at a home or a center, how can best practice or leading practice elements be integrated? How do they become accessible? and how do folks understand what those things mean for the overall space? So certainly, like, part of our takeaway is never like, oh God, it's got to be, you know, this beautiful thing that, you know, at Marygrove, which is beautiful. But we want those home-based providers that live 3 blocks away who walk through there to leave with an inspiration about component parts that might make sense in their space: lighting, paint color, ventilation, HVAC improvements. And one of the questions here in the chat, outdoor play space. We have a robust partnership with the National Wildlife Federation that's been working on outdoor play spaces. And so particularly with COVID, there was a stronger push to that. But there really is an attention to how is this applied to where I sit, right? Versus this whole idea that it's got to be, you know, expand. That's not the takeaway we want to leave folks with. It's this idea of what it could mean to each provider as they engage in the conversation.
So
Kirby,
that's,
can I just quick?
go ahead, Nancy.
Did you say the National Wildlife Federation you've been working with?
Yeah. I can send around some materials. We started some work, and then through National Children's Facilities Network, we've been trying to get them to expand into other places around the country. But yeah, it's kind of a cohort model where they work directly with providers and think about natural outdoor play spaces. And then it becomes this whole kind of like teaching tool and engagement. And so what we're trying to think about is how do we like think about the outdoor classroom? And that was like it was a forcing function of COVID a little bit, but this recognition that the access to outdoors actually is one of the research-based dimensions of this. And so the more that folks can really lean in, and then people are saying, well, that's, you know, if I'm a home-based provider and I'm working 14 hours a day, like when am I supposed to go to a workshop about outdoor play space, right? So how do we organize these resources and share those with providers is one of the things we're trying to work on. But yeah. I can get that to Rena.
And the other one was natural facilities. What you mentioned?
Oh, so the National Children's Facilities Network. That's the group of folks that have kind of CDFIs and others that have come together, and we're working on how to continue to implement supports for the early childhood ecosystem. We've created a like on that website, if you go to it, there's a Making Spaces series, and we're highlighting lots of things: best practice and co-location of early childhood and housing, outdoor play spaces, becoming a facilities champion, right? Some of those topics, but I can make sure I can get that through.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I saw the note maintenance. You're absolutely right, Eric. I totally agree. So part of what we looked at with Marygrove was, what does the long-term view of this building mean in the context of the overall Marygrove campus? And because that's part of this very robust, and when you come see it, you know, there's multiple aspects of that facility. The economics of maintaining the campus over time are different. However, we did look into and make investments in things like geothermal and some of those best practices. But yes, I mean, we always say this, right? You can go cut a ribbon, but then 25 years later, someone's got to fix the roof, someone's got to pay the utilities. And so it's all part of that's why I keep going back to the finance aspect.
Yeah. Which is
analysis. Yeah, please.
Yeah. And those are high use facilities.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it's not like, you know, maybe your common office building. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on. Kids are running bikes into walls, and there's a million things that can happen in that. And when you start to roll in issues around various sorts of compliance, licensing, and so on and so forth, you know, there's certain things you can't let slide, whether you can afford to pay for it or not at the time that it needs to be paid for. So it adds, you know, just the whole consideration, not only about the physical plant, but what that means for your operations and your planning is a really big thing when you do that, and especially if you're using it to some degree around, you know, because all the things that you described about, you know, the third teacher in the classroom and all of those things loses that juice,
right,
as the facility maybe starts to wear down and not have, you know, that same attraction.
Right. That's why I love the idea and I totally get it. If some philanthropy says we're not bricks and mortar people, I'm like, but are you strategic planning people? Do you help people with business planning? Can you help people think longer term about balance sheet? Like, so there's so many wonderful ways in which technical assistance and capacity building can stand shoulder to shoulder with folks that are interested in bricks and mortar for a more kind of longer term view. Versus sometimes the inclination is to say, well, it's bricks and mortar and that means it's just a facility. I'm like, we all know, right? Around operational and financial health, that it's linked to those other dimensions. And that's why I think it creates, when we start these kinds of conversations, I think it sometimes can present opportunities to figure out where they can lean in ways folks might not have previously.
Rachel Langford, we only have a few minutes, but I'm wondering if you want to get in here because you brought up home-based care and what you're doing. You know, it sounds like that's something you're working on in Portland. Do you want to say anything about that?
I don't really have much to add other than we are thinking really holistically about the whole ecosystem, and the majority of care is happening in people's homes. And so as we have new facilities funding coming on board, both locally and statewide, we're really thinking about equity and how we make sure we are investing in where people are. That's all I would say.
Yeah, I know we don't have time to get into all this right now, but I would really like to talk more with people who know or are interested around the access, the capital piece, and the capital allocation, particularly when you're talking about spaces that programs don't own. That whether that's how you get subsidies into that, how you work with, even in your home, you know, there's issues with making certain kinds of improvements and how that, right? So there's and who would loan or not loan. So I mean, there's a piece of this that's around the way money moves, right? That is in and of itself creates a whole host of issues that are problems, even if you had sort of the right kind of concept. Just even getting the money to move in the right way can be a really huge, and where it needs to move across who you are, where you are, what you are, and who's providing it, can make it really complicated. So anyway, that I would be interested in talking to more people about that. If there's any folks that want to talk more about that in and of itself.
One quick observation, or say Brian's colleague out in Chicago, is what we've also heard from other funders is if they are not exclusively invested in early childhood, the other benefit of supporting quality facilities is increasing physical assets in the community, enhancing community vibrancy, neighborhood revitalization, growing income, increasing economic activity as well. And that's where other funders who may not be having a focus in early childhood still believe in early childhood facilities for all of those reasons. So just wanted to share that's some of the feedback we've heard from others in the space as well.
Well, we're at time, but I feel like there's so many things we could have talked about. I would really want to go back to the churches situation, because I'm like, there's so many churches. Isn't that really a good plan? But I never thought about if the part of the reason you have excess churches or excess school buildings is because the community is declining, the impact that has. So, Jonathan, any last words? I'll give you we're at 3 o'clock, but do you have any last words or closing words for us? It sounds like there's more conversations we could think about together.
Yeah, no, we would love to dive in with others. We know Detroit is just a small sliver. And you know, the only reason we were highlighting Detroit is because you all are coming next month. But we're just excited to learn alongside others. And Eric, you know, some of the questions you lifted up and others. Excited to learn with y'all and super grateful to Kirby and our IFF partners for being the brains behind all of the work happening in Detroit.